You know those people. The ones who seem to be constantly in motion, juggling a million things, always talking about how busy they are, email flowing, meetings booked back to back. But somehow, when you look at what they've actually accomplished, the needle hasn't moved much at all.
Yes, absolutely. We've all seen them. And let's be honest, probably been them at times. It's that feeling of being swamped by activity, but without, you know, producing real results.
Right. And then on the flip side, you see others. They seem calmer, maybe less visibly frantic. They aren't shouting about their workload, but they consistently get the truly important things done.
They make significant progress, often quietly. No fuss, no drama. They just seem effective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What is that difference? It doesn't always seem to be about raw intelligence or like innate talent or even just pure hours worked.
Yeah.
Brilliant people who are utterly ineffective.
And people with maybe more modest gifts who accomplish tremendous things. There's something else going on there. A fundamental practice, maybe, an approach.
Yeah, something. And today we're taking a deep dive into some source material that speaks directly to that something else. This material was actually shared with us by one of you, our listeners, who wanted to understand the foundations of effectiveness.
Right, and we're talking about excerpts from a really foundational, a truly classic book on this very topic.
Oh.
Peter Drucker's The Effective Executive, the definitive guide to getting the right things done.
Peter Drucker. He was, well, a giant, wasn't he?
Yeah.
In management thinking?
Oh, without exaggeration. A prolific author, a really keen observer of society, organizations, consultant in some huge companies. His ideas shaped entire fields. And this book, even though it was first published back in the 60s, it remains incredibly relevant, really striking.
The title itself kind of gives away the core idea, getting the right things done. So Drucker isn't primarily focused on efficiency here, like doing things faster or cheaper.
Exactly. Efficiency is doing things right. Effectiveness, for Drucker, is making sure you're doing the right things in the first place, directing your limited time, your energy, towards the stuff that actually matters, the activities that produce the results you're aiming for.
Okay, that's a key distinction. And who is he aiming this book at? When he says executive, who does he mean? Just CEOs?
No, not at all. He defines it very broadly. It's not just about having a big office or managing lots of people. An executive, to Drucker, is basically any knowledge worker whose decisions have a significant impact on the performance and results of the whole organization.
Ah, okay, so it's less about managing people and more about the impact of your knowledge work and decisions.
Precisely. So yes, that includes traditional managers, definitely, but it also includes loads of individual professional contributors. Think about a chemist in a lab deciding which research paths to follow. That decision could shape the company's entire future product line.
Or a market researcher whose analysis points towards a major strategic shift.
Exactly. Or, a budget officer in a government agency. Their recommendations impact public spending significantly. These are all executive decisions because they have wide-ranging impacts. The number of people reporting to them, totally irrelevant. It's the result of their knowledge work that counts.
Got it. So this book is really for anyone using their knowledge, wanting to make a real impact, whatever their job title says. Why is it so important to, dive into Drucker's ideas on this now?
Because, and this is really central to his argument, effectiveness isn't some innate personality thing you're born with. It's not like charm or natural intelligence. It's a learned practice. Discipline.
Disciplinable.
Yes. And in our world today, complex, flooded with information, constantly interrupted, dominated by these large knowledge-based organizations just being smart or working hard, it isn't enough anymore to guarantee impact. Knowing how to focus your limited time, your energy, on the critical few things that really contribute, and knowing how to make sound, impactful decisions, that's absolutely crucial for individuals and for the organization.
It sounds like instead of just kind of muddling through, trying different productivity hacks and hoping something sticks, this book offers a systematic framework, a sort of learned shortcut to actually being effective.
That's exactly it. Drucker spent decades watching effective executives, figuring out what they did, and he distilled their habits into these practical disciplines. It's not just theory, it's about application.
And that's our mission today, right? For this deep dive, we're going to unpack these core lessons from the excerpts you shared, step by step.
Yeah, using Drucker's own insights, his examples from the source material to give you some practical takeaways, things you can maybe start thinking about, applying right away to boost your own effectiveness.
Okay, let's get into it. Starting with that really fundamental and honestly quite encouraging idea. Effectiveness can be learned. It's not magic.
Right. Let's unpack this first core lesson.
Yeah.
And it is foundational, and like you said, a huge relief. Effectiveness isn't some mystical gift. You're not born effective or ineffective. Drucker is absolutely clear. It can be learned.
He uses that analogy, doesn't he, about musical scales.
Yeah, it's a great one. He says effectiveness is like learning musical scales. Anyone with normal endowment, basically, you don't need to be a genius, just average intelligence, average capacity, can acquire competence. You might not become, a world-class concert pianist overnight, maybe never, but competence. Absolutely achievable for anyone willing to learn and practice the discipline.
That is liberating, isn't it? You don't have to compare yourself to some mythical, naturally gifted leader. You just need to be willing to learn the steps.
And this learnable aspect is so critical today because, as Drucker points out, our society is increasingly built on large organizations. And within those organizations, knowledge workers are dominant.
Right. He stresses this is kind of a new thing, historically speaking.
Totally. 100 years ago, government agencies were tiny. The entire Washington, D.C. establishment under Teddy Roosevelt could basically fit into one modern office building. Hospitals had very few health service professionals beyond nurses. Most staff did manual work.
And the knowledge workers who did exist, lawyers, doctors, teachers, they mostly worked for themselves, right? Independent professionals.
Exactly. But today, the center of gravity has completely shifted. Most people trained to use knowledge, theory, concepts. They work inside these large organizations, corporations, governments, universities, hospitals. And their effectiveness isn't about physical tasks anymore. It's about making their knowledge productive, contributing to the overall performance of that organization.
Which brings us back to his definition of executive. The knowledge worker making decisions with significant impact. They have this responsibility for their contribution.
And because of their specialized knowledge, they're expected to make better decisions in their area than anyone else. So yeah, managers fit, but so do countless individuals with zero direct reports. The chemist, the market analyst, the accountant setting policy. If their decisions have wide impact, they are executives in Drucker's world. Their effectiveness drives the organization's success in that specific area.
Okay, so what gets in the way? Why aren't all these smart, hardworking knowledge workers automatically effective?
Drucker points out several sort of inherent realities of modern organizational life that actively push executives towards ineffectiveness. The first one, probably the most relatable for everyone listening.
Time.
Ah, yes.
Constant battle.
Time, exactly. An executive's time is rarely their own. It belongs to or is claimed by everybody else. It's inherently fragmented. You're constantly reacting, requests from the boss, calls from your team, mandatory meetings, urgent emails, crises popping up. It's a world of constant interruption.
I think everyone listening feels that in their bones. Your day isn't a planned journey. It's more like a pinball machine.
That's a good way to put it. The second reality is that executives are deeply within the organization. They're inside the system, embedded in its processes, its politics, its daily grind. So there's this constant danger they become totally focused on internal stuff.
Like the departmental turf wars, the internal procedures, the office politics.
Yeah, all that. And they lose touch with the outside reality, where the actual results happen. The customers, the competitors, the market shifts, the societal changes, the things that truly determine success or failure.
He uses that analogy, right, about the surface area versus the mass of an organization.
Yes, it's fascinating. He compares a large organization to a biological organism where the mass grows much faster than the surface. As it gets bigger and more complex, more and more effort, resources, attention gets sucked into internal tasks, managing communication, coordinating departments, maintaining systems. The executive gets pulled deeper inside, further away from that crucial external environment where the real game is played.
You can almost feel that gravitational pull inwards as a company grows. That image really sticks.
A third reality. A knowledge worker's contribution is only effective if other people use it. And often, the most critical people who need your work aren't reporting to you. They're sideways, in other departments, or they're your superiors.
So my brilliant report or my amazing process improvement is basically useless unless I can make it understandable, relevant, and actionable for somebody else to pick up and run with.
Exactly. You depend on collaboration, on acceptance, across organizational lines. And finally, executives rely heavily on quantitative data, on analysis, which is vital, of course. But it can also be deeply misleading.
How so?
Because it often misses the crucial qualitative changes. Shifts in trends and customer behavior, in values and competitive dynamics, things that haven't yet shown up clearly in the numbers.
He uses the Ford Edsel example, right? The
Yeah.
classic cautionary tale.
Yes, all the quantitative data, all the market research numbers seemed to scream, go. It looked like the perfect car for the market at that time.
Yeah.
But it was a spectacular flop.
What did the numbers miss?
Drucker says the data missed a fundamental qualitative shift in why people bought cars. It was moving away from being purely income determined, by the biggest car you could afford, towards being taste determined. People started buying cars that reflected their identity, their lifestyle. The numbers lagged behind this basic shift in perception and values. By the time the data caught up, the Edsel was history.
And the thalidomide example is even more chilling.
It is. Initially, the quantitative data, the standard tests, classified the drug within existing safety parameters. It took human perception doctors noticing a pattern of unusual birth defects, raising the alarm, and then forcing a reevaluation before the quantitative data eventually confirmed the drug's devastating effects. Drucker's point is that the computer is a logic machine, great with numbers, but it's fundamentally bad at perceiving these crucial, often subtle qualitative shifts that shape the future. Effectiveness needs human perception, human judgment.
So these forces are constantly working against us. Fragmented time, being stuck inside the organizational bubble, depending on others to use our work, and the limits of purely quantitative data. It sounds, well, kind of daunting.
It does. But the core message of the book, the real promise, is that despite all these challenges, effectiveness can be learned. It can be practiced systematically. Like those musical scales, their specific disciplines, habits anyone with normal capacity can learn and use to counteract these forces.
And the very first of those foundational practices, the absolute bedrock, is tackling that most unique resource, time. Know thy time.
Absolutely foundational. Drucker calls it the base of the pyramid. His point is blunt. You simply cannot manage your time if you don't know where it actually goes. It sounds almost trivially simple, but it's profoundly difficult to do well in practice.
Why is it so hard, though, just tracking time?
Well, firstly, psychological experiments show humans are just notoriously bad at estimating time. We lose track easily. How long did that meeting really take? How much time did I spend on email? Relying on your gut feeling about where your time goes, it's completely unreliable. Guesswork, basically.
And secondly, as we just talked about, executive work is inherently fragmented. Pulled in a million directions, context switching all the time, makes it even harder to get a clear picture.
Right. And he makes the crucial point that many important tasks need not just some time, but significant uninterrupted blocks of time to be productive at all.
Yeah, things like deep thinking, complex problem solving, planning, writing something substantial.
Or even working effectively with people. Drucker says you need a fairly large minimum quantum of time, spending just 10 or 15 minutes with someone. Often useless for both of you. You probably need at least an hour, maybe more, for a meaningful discussion about their work, their plans, their performance. These critical tasks just don't fit into tiny, scattered time slots.
Okay, so how do you even begin to get a grip on this?
The first step, Drucker insists, is purely mechanical, but it's non-negotiable. Time diagnosis. You have to create a record, as accurately as possible. Where is your time actually going? He suggests this can even be done by an assistant, like the old time and motion studies for manual workers. Just knowing the reality, that's the essential starting point. It's not about efficiency yet, just awareness.
Okay, so you keep a time log for maybe a couple weeks. Then what? You analyze it, look for time wasters?
Exactly. You look at that log often with, frankly, a bit of shock, and you ask some hard questions. First, identify tasks that are just plain unproductive or unnecessary. The key question here is, what would happen if this were not done at all?
Or what if we just stopped doing this?
Right. And I suspect very often the honest answer is surprisingly little. Or you'd find out quickly enough if it was important and you could easily restart it. Drucker mentions a new U.S. president who initially accepted way too many invitations to unimportant events, realized it was killing his time for actual important work, and learned to ruthlessly prune those low-contribution activities.
You also need to look at time wasters caused by other people, right? The endless meetings, the constant calls, demands for reports that nobody really reads.
Yes, learning to say no, or at least to streamline those interactions, manage expectations, that's crucial. But then, and this is where Drucker gets really insightful about how organizations work, you identify time wasters caused by systemic flaws, bad processes, bad structure.
Okay, what kind of systemic flaws?
He identifies several key types. First, recurrent crises.
Ah, the quarterly forecast scramble, the year-end budget panic, the urgent project that pops up like clockwork every couple of months.
Yeah, exactly.
Huh.
Drucker argues that recurrent crises are rarely true emergencies. They're almost always symptoms of sloppiness, laziness in planning and execution. They're predictable disruptions that could have been anticipated and turned into routine processes or planned activities. He contrasts a chaotic, crisis-driven factory with a boring, well-managed one where potential crises are foreseen and handled methodically or prevented altogether.
So a well-managed system should actually be kind of boring because the predictable stuff is already handled. I like that.
It's a great insight. He gives examples like the annual panic in a company over sales forecasts, solved by simply changing the forecast from a single impossible number to a range, acknowledging uncertainty but allowing planning. Or the military's silly end-of-year spending spree to use up funds. Turned out a simple legal mechanism existed to transfer unused funds, but nobody had bothered to make it routine. Predictable problems need routine solutions.
Okay, so recurrent crises are one systemic time waster. What else?
Another big one, overstaffing. The symptom here is often that senior people, especially managers, are spending way too much time on problems of human relations, mediating feuds, sorting out turf battles, dealing with friction between people.
So too many people doesn't mean more gets done. It can mean more time managing the people.
Often, yes. Drucker argues this means people are simply getting in each other's way because there are too many bodies for the available work or the structure. They spend time on interpersonal dynamics instead of productive work. In a lean, well-structured setup, people have room to move, to act, without constant collisions or needing endless coordination meetings. Underemployed but overskilled people, Drucker says bluntly, have ample time only for mischief.
Mischief, huh? That sounds like a polite term for office politics.
It does, but it captures that unproductive energy, a third major time waster linked to poor organization. Too many meetings. Drucker has that famous, almost brutal line, one either meets or one works. One cannot do both at the same time.
Ouch. I feel that one deeply. My calendar sometimes feels like one long meeting.
Drucker saw meetings as a concession to deficient organization. Ideally, everyone would have the info and resources they need without constant group huddles. Now, some meetings are necessary, obviously, for cooperation, sharing info, making decisions. But if executives are spending, say, a quarter or more of their time in meetings, that's a flashing red light, a clear sign of fundamental malorganization.
And one meeting often breeds more meetings, right? Follow-ups, smaller groups, endless email chains.
Which is why meetings, when they are necessary, need to be rigorously purposeful, directed. An undirected meeting, where the objective isn't crystal clear, that's just a dangerous time sink. He praises Alfred Sloan's method at GM back in the day.
How did Sloan run meetings? Super disciplined. Start with a clear statement of the specific purpose. During the meetings, Sloan mostly listened intently. Rarely spoke except to clarify. Famously took no notes, said he needed to listen, not write. At the end, he'd sum up the discussion and decisions. And crucially, immediately after, a memo went out detailing conclusions, outlining specific assignments, setting deadlines, and naming who was accountable. That follow-through made his meetings effective, action-oriented.
Wow. Clear purpose, active listening, sum up, immediate documented action and accountability. That's a world away from many meetings.
Isn't it just? The last major systemic time waster Drucker flags is malfunction in information flow. This causes unexpected glitches, forces reactions, creates mini-crises simply because people lack timely, relevant info they need to do their jobs.
Like that hospital example in the source, the admissions clerk didn't know patients had been discharged, so they were scrambling to find beds that were actually empty. Exactly. A simple fix, making sure an extra copy of the discharge notice went straight to admissions, solved recurring stressful time waster. Lack of the right info at the right time forces people to improvise, redo work, waste effort.
Okay, so the process is record your time, reality check. Analyze the log. Find unproductive tasks, things caused by others, systemic flaws like crises, overstaffing, meetings, bad info flow. Prune ruthlessly. What's the final step after clearing away the junk?
Consolidating your discretionary time. After cutting out as much waste as you can, you look at the time that's left, the time that is potentially under your control, not dictated by others. And you find ways to consolidate it into meaningful large blocks.
How do effective people actually do that in a world of constant demands?
Drucker shares some great examples. He talks about a bank president he worked with. This guy scheduled 90-minute blocks of totally uninterrupted time for himself. He figured that was his maximum attention span for really tough stuff and the minimum time needed to tackle anything significant.
90 minutes. Okay.
And his secretary had strict orders. Hold all calls, all visitors during these blocks, except for two people, the President of the United States or his wife.
Huh. Now that's setting boundaries with clarity.
Right. And he found that basically no crisis, internal or external, couldn't wait 90 minutes. After his focus blocks, he'd have a dedicated half-hour slot just for returning calls and messages. He consciously found the time, scheduled it, and fiercely protected it for focused, high-value work. It's about deciding to control some of your time, not letting it all get fragmented by default.
That really shows the discipline required. It's not just about squeezing things in. It's about creating the right kind of time for the right kind of work.
So the bottom line for Know Thy Time is really clear. You can't manage time, your most limited, unique resource, if you don't know where it goes. Record it, analyze it, prune the waste, both activities and systems, and then consolidate what's left into usable, productive chunks.
Okay, moving from knowing where time goes to knowing what to focus that time on, the next core lesson is what can I contribute? This feels like a big mindset shift.
It's huge. This is about moving your focus from effort to results. The question stops being, how hard am I working? Or how busy am I? Or even, how good am I at my tasks? The question becomes, what contribution am I actually making to the results of the organization?
And it requires looking outward, doesn't it? Moving from what do I want to do, or what's my job description say, to what does the situation require, or what needs to be done for the organization to succeed. Directing energy towards outputs, impact, results, not just inputs or activities.
Right. And Drucker highlights that contribution isn't just one thing. It has dimensions, especially for executives. There are direct results, sales, production numbers, patient care outcomes. There's reaffirming values, keeping the organization true to its purpose. And there's building and developing people for the future. An effective executive thinks about all three.
Can you give an example from the material? How does this shift in focus practically change what someone does?
Yeah, the book uses a great example of an agency department in a large bank. Historically, their focus was totally internal. Efficiency. Correctly processing complex legal paperwork for corporate trust services. They were competent, accurate. But a new VP came in and asked a different question. What could this department actually contribute to the results of the entire bank?
Okay, so broadening the perspective, what did he see?
He realized the department had unique, high-level contacts with senior financial execs at customer companies. These are the very people making the buying decisions for all the bank services, not just trust stuff. The old focus on just processing paper efficiently meant this critical contact, this relationship, was being completely wasted from a larger perspective.
Yeah.
The real contribution opportunity. Leverage these contacts to become a proactive sales force for the whole bank.
So the same basic activity, talking to customer executives, suddenly had a completely different meaning and purpose. It shifted from internal efficiency, paperwork, to external contribution, generating business for the whole bank.
Exactly. Under his leadership, the department completely changed its approach. Staff were trained to spot opportunities, cross-sell other bank services. The department transformed from an efficient back-office unit into a successful marketing engine for the entire bank. The activity might have looked similar on a task list, but the purpose and the resulting contribution were vastly different and far more valuable.
What about that reaffirming values dimension? That seems a bit less tangible than sales numbers.
It is, but it can be incredibly powerful. The source gives that touching example from a hospital, Nurse Brian's rule. Nurse Brian wasn't a manager, just a long-serving, respected nurse. And she simply made it her habit, whenever a decision about patient care came up, to ask herself and others, are we doing the best we can possibly do to help this patient?
Just that simple question focused on the core value. What was the impact?
Patients on her floor consistently did better. And over the years, this simple question, this relentless focus on the ultimate contribution to the patient's well-being, became an informal guiding principle for the whole hospital. Even in tough staff meetings about resource trade-offs, someone would eventually ask, would this have satisfied Nurse Brian? This values-focused contribution drove better decisions and results, probably more than formal rules ever could, because it constantly pulled people back to the fundamental purpose.
That's amazing how one person's focus on contributing to a core value can ripple through an entire organization.
And the source material also shows how focusing on contribution changes what executives prioritize and do. Successful wartime leaders in Washington constantly shifted efforts based on what the war needed, not their old peacetime job descriptions. A retail chain CEO, a finance guy uncomfortable with people stuff, realized his unique contribution wasn't just numbers anymore, it was developing future managers. So he forced himself to prioritize that, despite his discomfort.
And the Robert McNamara example as defense secretary. He was data-driven, hated publicity, initially tried to delegate dealing with Congress.
Right, but he quickly realized that a huge part of the Secretary of Defense's unique, vital contribution had to be cultivating congressional support. It was difficult, maybe distasteful for him personally, but he forced himself to do it because it was essential for effective leadership in that specific role. It was required contribution.
It seems the higher up you go, the more your contribution shifts towards the outside market, customers, stakeholders like Congress.
Yes, because no one else in the organization typically has the same freedom or authority to make those critical external contributions effectively.
What about specialists, though? The deep experts. How does contribution apply when their work seems really niche?
That's a great question, especially now. And Drucker hits this hard. In a knowledge economy full of specialists, a specialist's contribution is only effective if other people can understand and use their specialized knowledge. This puts a responsibility on the specialist. You have to make yourself understood by the layman. And in modern organizations, that layman isn't usually ignorant. They're often just another specialist in a different field.
So the finance whiz needs to make their report clear and useful for the head of engineering. The scientist needs to explain findings so marketing can use them.
Exactly. The generalist in a knowledge organization, Drucker says, isn't someone who knows a bit about everything. They're a specialist who understands how their narrow field connects to the whole organization. And they take responsibility for making their expertise understandable and usable by other specialists who need it. If you can't do that, your valuable knowledge just becomes useless, isolated jargon.
That really reframes generalists. It's about connecting the dots between specialties.
And focusing on contribution also dramatically improves human relations. Instead of management just trying to communicate down or getting bogged down in personalities, asking your team, what contribution should we expect of you, fundamentally clarifies expectations. It shifts the focus from hierarchy to shared purpose.
It enables real communication, fosters teamwork.
Yes, and spontaneous collaboration.
Yeah.
Because everyone understands the common goal they're contributing towards. Think back to that hospital again. Formal committees didn't fix care, but Nurse Brian's focus on contribution, best for the patient, created the climate for effective teamwork. It aligns effort.
It really does sound like a unifying force.
It imposes an organizing principle on the daily chaos. It ensures activities have relevance. And, importantly, it drives your own self-development. Focusing on contribution makes you constantly ask, what do I need to learn or improve to make this contribution better? Or to make a different, more impactful contribution tomorrow? It's a powerful engine for personal growth.
And circling back to meetings, effective meetings, Drucker says always start with a clear statement of the purpose and the specific contribution they aim to achieve. Keeps them from becoming rambling talk fests.
Exactly. So what can I contribute? It shifts focus from tasks to results, forces an outward look, makes knowledge useful, improves relationships via shared purpose, and drives continuous self-improvement. It's a core discipline.
Okay, we've got knowing your time, focusing on contribution. Now, how do you maximize the output from that focused energy? The next lesson is making strength productive. This sounds key.
It's absolutely fundamental to Drucker's thinking. Effective executives focus on strengths. Their own strengths, their subordinate strengths, even their boss's strengths. They staff, assign work, and approach development by focusing on what someone can do well, where they have excellence, rather than mainly trying to fix weaknesses.
That seems, well, almost the opposite of a lot of traditional HR or performance management, doesn't it? So much focus often goes on identifying weaknesses, gap analysis, trying to make people well-rounded.
Drucker argues that human excellence is almost always specific excellence. People are rarely great at everything. You get outstanding results by putting outstanding ability to work, even if that ability comes with weaknesses elsewhere. He's pretty direct. You staff jobs and build teams based on the relevant strength needed. Two average people don't equal one good one. They often just get in each other's way. You look for that outstanding ability relevant to the task, even if the person isn't perfect overall.
This reminds me of that Lincoln story about General Grant and his supposed drinking.
Yes, it's a perfect illustration Drucker uses. Lincoln's response when criticized was reportedly something like, "If I knew his brand, I'd send a barrel to my other generals."
Lincoln needed a general who could win, who could pursue a strategy relentlessly. Grant demonstrated that strength when others couldn't. Lincoln didn't pick him for sobriety or lack of weakness. He picked him for the proven, crucial strength needed to win the war. He accepted the limitation to get the essential strength.
That really nails the principle, doesn't it? Accept the limitation because the strength delivers the needed results. And this focus on strength should also guide how jobs are structured. Drucker argues jobs should be objective, determined by the task that needs doing, not tailored around the personality or quirks of the current person in the role. Tailoring jobs to individuals. That creates chaos, favoritism, kills incentive for others to develop, and reduces the diversity of thinking the organization needs.
So the idea is define the job's demands clearly based on the contribution needed, and then find the person with the specific strength to crush that role.
Precisely. And appraisals, performance reviews, should reflect this. Drucker was critical of reviews focused on diagnosing weaknesses, often borrowing from psychology. A proper appraisal, he argued, should look forward, focused on performance and contribution against goals. The question should be, what can this person do really well? What have they done well? Where can their unique strengths be best used? And what do they need to learn or develop to make their strengths even more productive?
It's fundamentally about building on what works, what's strong, not remediating every fault.
Exactly. Now, Drucker is crystal clear. Character and integrity are different. Weakness there is an absolute disqualifier. Period. Any flaw in character must be dealt with decisively. But in other areas, skills, knowledge, style, personality quirks, weakness is just a limitation you accept to get the strength you need. Don't dwell on what people can't do. Focus all energy on putting what they can do brilliantly to work.
But what about when someone, even focusing on strength, is just not performing in a specific role? What about removing non-performers?
He says it's necessary. And, maybe surprisingly, he argues it's fair. Fair to the organization that needs results, fair to the person's subordinates who are held back by an ineffective boss, and ultimately fair to the individual themselves. They often know they're struggling and might secretly want out of a role where they can't succeed. Offering alternatives like a different role or returning to a level where they were effective should be explored. But removing someone who consistently fails to perform with distinction in a key position, that's the duty of the effective executive.
Sounds tough, but necessary for the whole system to be productive.
He uses the incredible example of General George C. Marshall building the U.S. Army staff for World War II. Marshall relentlessly focused on officers' strength, put them where those strengths could have maximum impact, even if it broke seniority rules. He famously helped promising officers mitigate limitations like pairing the young Major Eisenhower, who initially lacked strategic grasp, with mentors and assignments to build that strength. He promoted the best qualified, period. He felt he owed it to the job, the person, and the troops.
And how did Marshall handle removing a commander who wasn't cutting it?
Drucker highlights that Marshall saw it less as judging the officer and more as his own mistake in appointing them to that unsuitable role. This perspective allowed him to remove commanders without necessarily ending their careers, often finding other roles where their strengths could be used. Just not that command role. It was remarkably effective and humane.
So making strength productive isn't just about your team, it's also how you manage up. How does Drucker suggest you make your boss effective?
He says this is surprisingly easy, yet often missed. The key: focus on making your boss's strengths productive. Forget their weaknesses, forget trying to reform them, stop complaining about them. Ask yourself, what can my boss do really well? What are their key strengths? And crucially, what do they need from me so they can use those strengths effectively?
That completely changes the dynamic, doesn't it? It's not about changing them, it's about enabling them.
Exactly, except that your boss, like everyone, has strengths and limitations. Your job is to enable them to do what they do well. By aligning your work, your contribution, to support their strengths and meet their needs, you make them more effective, which in turn makes you more effective because your contribution gets received and used. He gives the example of a civil servant helping successive political bosses use their strengths, maybe dealing with Congress, maybe public speaking. That civil servant gains influence.
It's not about sucking up, it's strategic alignment to ensure your own work has impact by enabling the person above you.
And finally, making yourself effective. Lead from your own strength. Know yourself. Know your work habits. Are you a morning person? Night owl? Do you draft quickly or edit meticulously? Think best writing or talking, good in big groups or one-on-one. Understand your strengths, your style, and build on what comes relatively easily where you excel. Don't force yourself into a mold that doesn't fit. Find the pattern in your own successes and lean into it.
So effectiveness isn't about becoming someone else. It's about understanding who you are, how you work best, and leveraging that.
Drucker sums it up powerfully. Making strength productive isn't about changing people. It's about multiplying performance capacity for the organization, for society, by putting to use whatever strength, health, and aspiration individuals possess, despite their inevitable limits.
Okay. Manage time, focus on contribution, make strengths productive. These feel like building blocks for channeling energy. How do you make sure that energy goes to the most important things? The next lesson. First things first.
Right. If you had to pick one secret to executive effectiveness, Drucker says this is it: concentration. The discipline of focusing your limited time, energy, resources, doing first things first, and doing one thing at a time.
Why is concentration so critical for an executive?
Because even after you master time management and cut the waste, there's always going to be more to do than time allows. Your time will still be fragmented by demands. You have to choose where to apply your finite resources. And you need to focus that limited time and energy where it yields the biggest results, typically on the opportunities, not just fighting fires.
That endless stream of tasks, emails, requests, potential projects, you absolutely have to choose what to focus on, and just as crucial, what not to focus on.
And concentration is also needed, Drucker notes, because frankly, most people find it hard enough to do one thing well at a time, let alone juggle multiple significant tasks. To apply your skills productively, you have to bring them to bear intensely on a single task. Focus until it's done, or at least until significant progress is made.
So, how do you decide what the first things actually are? How do you achieve this focus?
The first crucial practice for concentration is something Drucker calls regularly sloughing off yesterday. This means periodically reviewing your activities, your commitments, and your teams, and asking a fundamental, often tough question. If we weren't already doing this, knowing what we know now, would we start doing this today?
Oh. And if the honest answer isn't a clear, enthusiastic yes.
Then Drucker insists you should drop it, or at least curtail it sharply. The real challenge, the critical part, isn't just stopping. It's actively pulling resources, especially your best people, your scarce talent out of yesterday's tasks, and redirecting them onto tomorrow's opportunities. Organizations and individuals get trapped by past successes or old commitments.
This applies everywhere, doesn't it? Individuals, big companies, even government.
Absolutely. Drucker uses government programs as a prime example. They're often set up as if they'll last forever, becoming entrenched bureaucracies with vested interests, even when they're totally obsolete. He mentioned the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, regulating railroads like a monopoly decades after trucks and planes changed everything. Or farm programs designed for the 1930s, completely irrelevant to modern agriculture, but still soaking up resources.
So government desperately needs to slough off yesterday on a regular basis.
Drucker went further. He suggested a principle. Every government act, agency, program should be considered temporary. It should automatically expire after, say, 10 years, unless specifically renewed based on a rigorous review proving its results and current relevance. He saw McNamara's program review at Defense as a step, but argued the default assumption should be obsolescence, requiring a proof of necessity to continue, not permanence until proven obsolete.
Wow, that would totally flip the inertia. Forced justification instead of assuming continuation.
Another key part of First Things First is consciously avoiding being controlled by pressures. Urgent problems, crises, real or manufactured, immediate demands, they all scream for attention. But these pressures inherently pull you towards the internal, the past, the crisis itself, the immediate.
Which, as we said earlier, are exactly the things that push executives towards being ineffective.
Precisely. Effective executives fight this pull. They consciously focus on the outside reality, the future, the opportunities, the strategic issues, not just the urgent problem of the day. This takes discipline, especially at the top, because nobody else is really positioned to maintain that crucial external focus where the organization's true results are determined.
And this focus means actively setting posteriorities, making conscious choices about what you are not going to do.
This is often the hardest part, right? Deciding what not to do. Because it's usually someone else's priority. Someone thinks it's important. And you always worry, what if I drop the ball on something that turns out to be critical? But Drucker is firm. You have to say no to things to concentrate. He points out that postponing something is often the same as abandoning it anyway, because reality shifts while you wait. That old merger idea, the strategic landscape changed, that person putting off medical school year after year, it eventually becomes impossible.
So you have to make the hard call, even with the risk involved.
And this is where courage comes in. Drucker explicitly says setting priorities and posteriorities requires courage, not just analysis. It's always easier to try and do a little bit of everything, keep all options open. but that guarantees nothing gets done with the intensity needed for real effectiveness.
What are Drucker's rules, then, for identifying the priorities that deserve this courage and focus?
He lays out 4 key rules for picking the first things. 1. Pick the future over the past. Focus energy on emerging opportunities or future needs, not yesterday's problems or faded glories.
Okay. Future over past.
2. Focus on opportunity over problem. Converting an opportunity into results is often more productive and actually less risky than solving a problem, which usually just gets you back to where you were before the problem hit yesterday's normal.
Opportunity over problem. Makes sense.
3. Choose your own direction over the bandwagon. Don't just chase what's hot or what everyone else is doing. Pick priorities that align with your unique strengths, your context, your strategy.
Your direction, not the crowd's. Got it.
And 4. Aim high. Focus your efforts on something that will make a significant difference, rather than just playing it safe with easy wins.
Aiming high. That feels particularly challenging when you're trying to manage risk.
Drucker points out that doing something small and new often takes just as much effort and carries just as much risk as doing something big and new. So given that, you might as well aim for the thing that, if it works, will have a truly meaningful impact. Make the effort count.
Okay, so the practice of concentration boils down to this discipline. Regularly review, cut the obsolete slew off yesterday. Resist the tyranny of the urgent. Avoid pressure control. Consciously decide what not to do. Set posteriorities. And then focus intensely on the true first things, using those 4 rules: future, opportunity, own direction, aim high.
Concentration, Drucker concludes, is ultimately the courage to impose your own thoughtful decision on your time and events, rather than just being pushed around by them.
That's a really powerful way to frame it. And that leads us perfectly into the final core lessons covered in the material chapters 6 and 7, focusing on the elements of decision-making and effective decisions.
Right. Decision-making is, for Drucker, the specific defining task of the executive remembering that broad definition. Anyone making decisions with significant organizational impact. And a core discipline is making effective decisions.
And reading the material, he argues effective executives don't necessarily make tons of decisions.
No, exactly the opposite. They tend to make relatively few, but very important decisions. They focus on the big picture, the strategic level. They deal with what's generic problems that signal an underlying issue needing a rule or principle, rather than getting bogged down making lots of small reactive firefighting decisions. They aren't impressed by speed or juggling lots of variables. Drucker saw that as often leading to sloppy thinking. They prioritize soundness and impact over just being clever or fast.
Okay, so how do they approach making these few crucial effective decisions? He lays out a systematic process, right?
Yes, a clear sequence of steps. Step 1 is classifying the situation. Is this a generic problem? A symptom of something recurring that needs a rule, a policy, a principle? Or is it a truly unique event that needs to be handled individually?
Like, a machine part keeps failing, that's probably generic, needs investigation into stress or maintenance, versus a one-off power outage from a lightning strike that's unique.
Precisely. And misclassifying the situation, Drucker argues, is the most common reason for making the wrong decision. You develop rules and policies for generic situations so they can be handled routinely, freeing up your top-level thinking for the truly unique events that demand judgment. He gives the example of the U.S. military struggling to retain doctors. They kept misclassifying it as a simple pay problem. Generic solution, raise pay. But the real deeper issue was structural military medicine wasn't aligning with the profession's move towards specialization in private practice. That needed a different kind of principle, a different solution entirely.
Okay, step 1. Classify, generic versus unique. Step 2. Defining the problem, getting to the real issue at the highest level possible.
Yes, and this is often different from the obvious symptom. It means looking beyond the immediate mess to grasp the fundamental challenge. Alfred Sloan at GM in the 1920s, he didn't just see chaos as personality clashes. He defined the problem at a high level, a fundamental constitutional issue, a lack of clear organizational structure. That led him to the generic solution of decentralization with coordinated control, a principle that shaped GM and so much of modern management.
Or Theodore Vail at Bell System. He didn't just see it as profit maximization.
Right. He defined the problem as needing universal service and continuous innovation for the public good. That led him to seek regulation and set up Bell Labs. These are high-level, strategic definitions of the core problem.
Which leads to step 3, defining the boundary conditions. What must the decision actually achieve? What are the minimum specs it has to meet to be effective?
Clear boundary conditions are absolutely crucial. You have to think through, What must this accomplish to succeed? What are the minimums? Decisions that only work if nothing whatever goes wrong. Drucker calls those dangerous because their boundary conditions are impossible in reality. They fail this test. Sloan's GM structure, for instance, had clear boundary conditions. It had to provide both operating autonomy to divisions and central financial control. Both were non-negotiable.
Step 4. Working out what is right. This one sounded interesting.
Drucker gives some very direct advice here, based on his own early consulting with Sloan. Sloan told him, always start by figuring out the decision that would be right. The ideal solution that fully meets all the boundary conditions. Only after you know what right looks like do you start thinking about the compromises, the adaptations, the concessions needed to make it acceptable or feasible in the real world.
I loved that Sloan quote in the material. Don't concern yourself with the compromises. There is not one executive who does not know how to make every single conceivable compromise. But he can't make the right compromise unless you first tell him what right is. That's brilliant.
It really is. The danger is compromising too early, before you even know what the ideal looks like. If you start by asking what's acceptable, you'll never get the best possible outcome. You'll just land on the wrong compromise. You need that vision of right to guide your adjustments.
Okay, step 5. Building action into the decision. Drucker says a decision isn't really made until specific action commitments are built in.
Yes, this means nailing down.
Yeah.
Who's responsible for doing what, by when? And critically, who needs to know about this decision and these actions so they can implement them or adjust their own work? He gives examples. A chemical company had a brilliant plan for blocked currency abroad, but it failed because nobody was assigned responsibility for follow-through. Action wasn't built in.
Or the chairman announcing reforms but then promoting the old guard. The action killed the decision.
Exactly. Or the company discontinuing a product but forgetting to tell purchasing, who kept buying parts for years. Asking who needs to know is vital. The decision must also be appropriate for the capabilities of the people who have to execute it.
So, actionable steps and clear communication are part of the decision itself, not just an afterthought. And the final step in the process.
Step 6. The feedback mechanism. Testing the decision against reality.
How does that work?
This is crucial. Drucker hammers this. You must build in ways to check if the decision is actually being implemented as intended. And just as important are the assumptions you base the decision on still valid out there in the real world. His key advice is simple but profound. Go and look. Don't just rely on reports and numbers.
Like the general tasting the troops' food or Truman saying orders aren't carried out unless you check?
Precisely. Reports are filtered, abstracted. You need direct exposure to see if the decision is translating into action on the ground. And it's vital for checking those assumptions. Reality changes. Circumstances shift. The assumptions you made 6 months ago might be totally wrong now. Failure to go and look, to test against reality, is why organizations stick with outdated, ineffective strategies long after they've stopped working.
So those 6 steps: classify, define, boundary conditions, what's right, build in action, feedback form the backbone. What about other practical wisdom for making effective decisions? Chapter 7 adds more, right?
Yes, some really key insights. First, counterintuitive advice. Don't start with facts, start with opinions.
Opinions, really? Isn't that risky? Aren't decisions supposed to be fact-based?
Drucker argues people always start with opinions anyway. Pretending otherwise is just dishonest. Opinions are hypotheses, potential explanations, possible solutions. The effective executive encourages people to state their opinions, but then insists that whoever voices an opinion must also define what facts, what data, what criteria, what experiment would be needed to test this opinion's validity. You figure out what information is relevant to test the hypothesis before you go collecting everything under the sun. Otherwise, you just drown in data.
Okay, so opinions are fine as long as they're framed as testable hypotheses. Got it. What else?
Second, and maybe even more counterintuitive, disagreement is necessary. Effective decisions, Drucker argues, are almost always judgments hammered out through the clash and conflict of different views. Through adversary proceedings, consensus right at the start. That's a huge red flag.
Wow, that cuts against the grain of wanting everyone on board, getting buy-in, smooth sailing.
Drucker pushes back hard. He quotes Sloan again. If everyone in a meeting agreed immediately, Sloan would postpone the decision. He figured they hadn't really explored the issue properly if there's no disagreement. You need to develop disagreement, understand the opposing views, before making a sound choice.
Why is disagreement so vital?
He gives 3 main reasons. First, it's your only protection against being railroaded by the organization's special interests or political factions who might have narrow reasons for pushing one view. Second, disagreement stimulates imagination. It forces you to look beyond the obvious, think differently, and often leads to more creative, robust solutions. He mentions FDR deliberately creating disagreement among advisors to vet all sides. Disagreement, he says, turns on the tap of creativity.
And the third reason.
It clarifies your own understanding. By grappling with why others disagree, you understand the complexities, the potential pitfalls, the nuances of the decision much more thoroughly.
So you actively seek out informed disagreement before committing.
Yes. Listen to the arguments for the other side. Ask, what do the people who disagree see as the real issue here? What are their concerns? It's not about being difficult. It's about intellectual rigor. Finally, Drucker gives clear guidance on the actual decision to act or not act.
What are those guidelines?
He says, if the situation is trivial or will likely fix itself, de minimis non curat praetor, the law doesn't sweat the small stuff, do nothing. If the potential benefits of acting clearly outweigh the risks and costs, act. If it's in the middle, not trivial, but not a disaster or huge opportunity either, you have to weigh the effort and risk of action against the risk of inaction. But the absolute key rule here, he stresses, act or don't act. Never hedge. Never take half action.
Like the surgeon leaving half the tonsils in, that image sticks.
Precisely. Half action often carries most of the risk and effort of full action, but doesn't solve the problem. It usually makes things worse, creates a messy, unstable situation. If action is needed, commit fully. If the risks of action outweigh the benefits or the risks of inaction, then consciously decide not to act and accept the status quo. But avoid that messy middle ground of doing things halfway.
Drucker wrote this as computers were becoming more common. What was his take on their impact on decision-making?
His view is that the computer's main impact isn't that it takes over decisions, but that its very limitations force humans to become better decision makers.
How does that work?
Well, computers only do logic. They can only handle generic situations where you can define clear rules and principles in advance. They can't improvise, handle truly unique events, or make judgments based on fuzzy variables or qualitative shifts. So to use a computer for something like inventory control, you first have to think through all the possible scenarios, anticipate problems, define the governing principles and decision rules beforehand.
So it forces anticipation, systematic thinking, a focus on principles.
Exactly. It converts what used to be maybe operating adjustments, improvisations, reactive decisions into true anticipated decisions made at a higher level based on principles. This means more people lower down, who might have just reacted before, now need to become decision makers themselves, or at least participate intelligently in defining the rules the computer follows.
It pushes decision-making capability further down into the organization, makes more people executives, in his sense.
It forces the focus onto generic situations, not just treating symptoms. And as a tool, the computer, by handling routine data, should free up senior executives from being buried in internal reports, making it easier for them to go and look, to focus on that external reality. The computer demands more effective human decision-making, both upstream and downstream.
Wow. So the computer doesn't replace the effective executive. It actually makes the need for effective human decision-making even more critical and more widespread.
It makes effectiveness, especially in decision-making, a requirement for way more people in a knowledge organization, not just a few at the top.
Okay, we've taken a really deep dive here into the 5 core practices Drucker lays out. Knowing your time, focusing on contribution, making strengths productive, concentrating on first things first, and the systematic approach to effective decisions. That is, well, that's a lot to take in and actually do.
It is, but Drucker stresses over and over. Effectiveness isn't some grand theory or a single trick. It's a self-discipline. It's built practice by practice, step by step. You don't just wake up effective one day. You become effective by consistently applying these disciplines.
And they really do build on each other, don't they? You manage your time to get the blocks for focus. You focus that work on contribution. You leverage strengths to maximize that contribution. You concentrate to direct energy to the right things. And you make sound decisions about where to put that energy and how to act.
And learning this, practicing it, isn't just about your own career, although it certainly helps that. Drucker argues it has a much bigger impact. It lifts the performance capacity of the entire organization. An organization with more effective people, it changes the whole climate. It attracts good people, motivates higher performance, and ultimately lets the organization do different things, tackle bigger challenges, pursue new goals it couldn't reach before.
It feels incredibly relevant today, maybe even more so than when he wrote it decades ago. In this global, knowledge-driven economy, making knowledge workers productive, effective, it's essential, right? for companies, for countries.
Absolutely. Drucker saw it as the key challenge for organizations and societies built on knowledge work. But beyond just economics, making knowledge workers effective also meets a crucial social need. Knowledge workers, even if relatively affluent, can suffer from alienation in large organizations. Boredom, frustration, feeling like a conned because they're professionals, their identity tied to knowledge. But they often feel stuck in a hierarchy, subordinating their knowledge to goals they don't understand or believe in.
Effectiveness, by giving them a framework to focus on contribution, make impactful decisions, it helps them find meaning, purpose in their work.
Precisely. By providing clear standards, learnable habits, and fostering a climate that encourages this kind of systematic, focused, purposeful self-training and effectiveness, organizations can fight that alienation and truly leverage their most valuable and most expensive resource, the knowledge worker.
So effectiveness isn't just a personal skill or a management fad, it's fundamental for organizational health, performance, societal well-being, and individual fulfillment.
Drucker's conclusion is that mastering effectiveness is crucial for the well-being of both the individual and modern society itself. It's that important.
That is a powerful, big picture takeaway, and it brings us right back to you, the listener, and the material you shared that sparked this whole deep dive. If effectiveness is a learned discipline, like those musical scales, if it's something you can actively practice and get better at, then what specific practice, what one discipline from Drucker's framework will you focus on learning, practicing, implementing, starting today, to make a significant difference in your own effectiveness, your own contribution?
Will it be maybe diligently tracking and analyzing your time, really finding those wasted hours? Will it be consciously shifting your focus away from just effort and tasks to asking, what is my real contribution here? Will you start actively looking for and trying to leverage the strengths in yourself and the people around you?
Will you pick one true first thing to concentrate on and consciously decide what yesterday's tasks and pressures you're going to set aside? Or maybe pick one step in that decision-making process, classifying the problem, defining boundary conditions, and apply it systematically to your next important judgment.
The choice is yours. But Drucker lays out the opportunity to become significantly more effective, make a much greater impact with your knowledge, your effort. It's clearly there. It's within reach. One step, one practice at a time.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Peter Drucker's The Effective Executive.